Hello? Okay. This is Brant Barris interviewing. I'll let him speak for himself, but this is my oral history project. So, who are you?
I'm Kent Barris, Brant Barris's father. I am an old dad, so I'm 66 years old.
Okay. I'm going to be asking you questions on stuff from the Cold War. You okay with that?
I'm okay with whatever questions you want to ask. I don't have to answer them if I don't want to.
That is true.
Ask away.
Okay. Can you tell me where you were and how you felt when the rocket launched when we landed on the moon?
That was, I believe, in about 1967.
I think so, yeah.
And we were watching on television the live coverage, and he announced, was it Armstrong? Announced that he had landed on the moon, and one small step for a man, a giant leap for mankind. And we were astonished, and it was a full moon, I believe. And we all rushed outside and just stared at the moon in the front yard where I was living in Provo at the time. And we were trying to get our heads around the fact that somebody was standing on the moon, astronauts from our country, and it made us very proud. But it was still hard to get your head around the fact that this was the first person that actually got there and walked on the moon.
Um, did you have any doubts about like when we landed on the moon, or did you
No
believe it?
doubts, just amazement that we could do such a thing. The technology involved, the size of the rockets that carried them out there, how far away they seemed. That you wished you could look through a powerful telescope and see them actually standing there, but of course that was impossible at the time. Now we could probably do that in some way, but astonishment, not really doubt. In those days, we thought America could do anything.
Okay. Um, Next question. Tell me about the day you learned that JFK was assassinated and how you felt after
That
he was
was in about
assassinated.
1963, I believe, in November. And I was living in Cedar City with my family at the time, of course. I wasn't very old. We were living on a little street called Kayenta on the southwest part of town. And it wasn't a cold day for November. I was playing in the backyard with either a friend or with my one of my siblings. We had 8 children in our family. And my father came onto the back porch, and my mother must have been in the backyard. And he said, honey, the president has been shot. And it was very somber. He was very upset. And then a little while later, he came back and said, the president is dead. And we were very sober and very sad and couldn't imagine how somebody or why somebody would want to kill the president of the United States. It was shocking and horrible at the same time. There was kind of a somber feeling that settled over the whole community, it seemed like, and certainly over our household. Although we may not have liked his politics, I don't remember much about politics in those days. We were certainly respectful of the president and could not believe that somebody had been so evil as to kill the president of the United States.
Uh, um, okay. How did you feel when the 26th Amendment to the Constitution is ratified, lowering the voting age from 21 to 18?
So that amendment was ratified when I was about 14 years old. The Vietnam War was in full swing. And the strongest argument in favor of it was if you were old enough to be drafted and killed for your country, you were certainly old enough to vote for your country, vote in the elections of your country to elect leaders. And I remember on the news they would cover the Vietnam War every night on the news a little bit, and the number of people who had been killed, the number of enemy soldiers who had been killed. And at the time, I thought that we were fighting a good war, and that America always won. And I thought it was perfectly fair that 18-year-olds would have the vote because they were being drafted. There was a lottery system when I was a young man of draft age, and if your number came up, you didn't have much choice in it. I guess that started a couple of years later, but it certainly was a powerful argument, and I agree with the sentiment. The government is going to send you somewhere to die. You have a right to help choose your leaders.
You. My next question is about the Vietnam War stuff. But you said at the time you thought right in Vietnam. Like, what made you change your mind about that?
The body count kept growing and growing, and it seemed like we were expanding the war and not finishing the war. And I didn't know very much about Asians at the time, but years later, well, not that many years later, I actually helped with some refugees from Vietnam. Some were from North Vietnam. If you're not familiar with the history, the North Vietnamese were fighting the South Vietnamese, and the Americans had replaced the French to try and help win the war. But it was, we thought the North Vietnamese were the bad guys and that they were supported by the Chinese. But afterwards, when I was dealing with refugees, these were just people, and some of them were from North Vietnam, and some of them were from South Vietnam, and they were all being persecuted because they were Chinese. So I could speak the language at the time, and in talking with those people, they were terrified, and had been forced out of their country, and they didn't hate Americans. They were living here, and they were a little uncomfortable because they remembered Americans bombing Hanoi, where they had lived in North Vietnam. And, they mentioned that to me one day after a long association. I was helping teach some of them English and other things. It was about 1978, 79 when I was doing that. And I realized that, no matter what war you're fighting, most of the people who are doing the dying don't really have much of a choice about it. Their governments send them into war to settle some difference or some political view, and it should not reflect badly on the people. It's just a very sad thing that people who love their children, same way that we love our children, are dying, and innocent people are dying to satisfy some political argument. Very much in retrospect against the fighting that we're doing, and by extension, what's going on in the Ukraine is not being reported accurately. Don't want to get into that, but supposedly helping the Ukrainians, who are the good guys, fight the Russians, who are the bad guys, and it's not the case. Zelensky, the president of Russia, is an evil man, corrupt. He's an oligarch, tons of money, and he began shelling his own people, the provinces where the minority Russians lived, and sent over 2,000 salvos, missiles, bombs, rockets in civilian areas in eastern Ukraine. And these were ethnic Russians. Russia said, well, we got to help these people because they're being bombarded. So Zelensky provoked the situation, but I know Ukrainian people, and they're good people, neighbors that are Ukrainian. Talked with them and helped them out a bit on occasion, and war is a terrible thing. And our politicians should be very, very careful about how they execute it. And we haven't, since World War II, engaged in very many good wars. We've engaged in plenty of bloodshed and plenty of assaults on little governments here and there for political purposes, but it's not a good thing. We should figure out a better way.
I actually agree with you there. Okay. Another question. Can you describe where you were and how you felt when the Berlin Wall fell down?
That was remarkable. Yes. I was here in Provo again, and we were watching the news, and it was totally stunning. to think that the Berlin Wall, which was set up in the 60s, maybe earlier, probably earlier, um, was falling, and we'd hoped for it, we'd prayed for it, and there was the video footage of people standing on the wall and knocking the wall down. And I, I recently heard a story from a security officer that was in Berlin at the time, and he told me some background information about the way the wall came down. And he said the Russians were actually misinterpreted. They were in a meeting in the East, in Berlin, and somebody asked a question about when the wall could come down. And they said, well, we're not basically prepared for that to happen, but in theory, would be willing to discuss that. And the translator rushed out and mistranslated the message, saying the wall will come down. And the troops were told, and people began mobbing the wall and knocking it down, and they brought in bulldozers and started to work on it. And the government at that point, miraculously, the Germans, the East Germans, supported by the Russians, said, okay. They didn't do anything to oppose it because the bloodshed would have been massive. And but we rejoiced. The whole world celebrated when the wall came down.
Wow. Okay. That's all the questions I have. Thank you for your time for this interview. I really appreciated it. I hope I get a good grade.
Of
Yeah.
course. Good luck with that. I mean, you could ask a bunch more questions. I got lots to say, but you don't want to hear it. So
I mean,
good luck with
I mean,
that.
I do.
But
I mean,
for the context of the assignment, I've said enough. Is that what you're telling me?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Old guys have a hard time knowing when to be quiet, so I'm going to be quiet now.
All right. Well, thank you again, and yeah.
You're welcome.